Thanks, Pervy K, for introducing us. Let's be honest. Most businesses today are trying their best with cybersecurity, but half the time it feels like guesswork. You've got people telling you to buy this tool, patch that system, train those users, lock down this bit of the network, and before you know it, you've got a to-do list longer than your arm and no idea which bits actually matter. And that's the real problem. It's not that organizations aren't doing enough, it's that they're doing plenty, just not always in the right places. So what I want to talk about today is how you figure out what actually matters for your business and how a simple benchmarking exercise can give you the clarity you've been missing. Let's start with a story that will feel familiar to lots of people. A firm once told me they were investing heavily in a new threat detection platform. It was expensive, impressive, and promised all sorts of clever capabilities. But when we dug into their environment, we found that half their laptops hadn't been patched in months. Their administrator accounts were sprawling across the estate, and nobody could quite agree on which systems were actually business critical. They were trying to build a high-tech security tower on foundations made of sand. Not because they were careless, but because they were busy. They were reacting to whatever felt urgent that week, and like many organizations, they assumed that the most sophisticated solution must be the most important one. I've seen the opposite too. A small organisation with barely any budget, no fancy tooling, and a tiny IT team. But they had discipline, they patched on time, they kept a clean asset list, they had strong access control. They tested their backups. They didn't look impressive on paper, but when they had an incident, they recovered faster than companies 10 times their size. They weren't perfect, but they had the foundations right, and that made all the difference. And the funny thing is, they didn't think they were doing anything special. They just did the basics consistently, and that put them ahead of a lot of bigger, better funded organizations. The first company is an example of how cybersecurity efforts drift off course, not through incompetence, but through momentum. A phishing incident leads to a new training module. A supplier breach leads to a third-party audit. A regulator mentions something in passing, and suddenly it becomes a project. Over time, the organisation ends up with a patchwork of activity that looks productive but doesn't necessarily reduce risk in any meaningful way. Security teams feel like they're constantly firefighting. Leadership feels like they're constantly signing off budgets without seeing the needle move. Everyone is working hard, but not always on the things that matter most. And the reason this happens is simple. Most organisations don't have a clear, shared understanding of what the business actually depends on. Not in theory, not in a policy document, but in reality. Which systems would stop the business in its tracks if they went down? Which processes rely on one person who never takes a holiday? Which suppliers could you simply not operate without? Which data sets would cause real damage if they leaked? And which threats genuinely apply to your sector rather than just making headlines? I once worked with a company that thought their most critical system was their CRM. It was the one everyone talked about, the one with the biggest license cost, the one that had the most visible impact when it loaded down. But when we mapped out their actual business processes, the real dependency was a tiny, ancient database that only one team used. If that database went down, the entire invoicing process stopped. Nobody got paid. The CRM could disappear for a week and they'd survive. But that little database, that was the real crown jewel, and nobody had backed it up properly in years. That's the kind of thing you only discover when you stop guessing and start looking at the business as it actually works. Once you understand that, prioritization becomes clearer. You stop treating all risks as equal. You stop assuming every control is as important as the next. You start seeing the difference between the foundations, the things that hold everything together, and the enhancements that only make sense once the basics are solid. Take asset management. It's not glamorous. Nobody gets excited about a tidy inventory, but if you don't know what you've got, where it is, and who owns it, every other control becomes harder. I've seen organisations spend thousands on vulnerability scanning, only to discover the scanner wasn't even pointing at half the estate because nobody knew those servers existed. I've seen teams proudly show me their patching dashboard, only for us to find out that half the devices weren't even enrolled in the system. And it's not because they were lazy, it's because they didn't have visibility. And while we're on patching, I've seen organisations with beautiful patching reports that show 98% compliance. But when you dig into it, the 2% that aren't patched are the systems that actually matter, the ones that run the business, the ones nobody wants to touch because they're fragile or old or undocumented. And those are the ones attackers love. Access control is the same story. You can have the best monitoring in the world, but if you've got old admin accounts lying around like forgotten keys under a doormat, you're asking for trouble. I once found an admin account that belonged to someone who'd left the company 6 years earlier. Nobody had noticed because the account didn't cause any problems. It just sat there quietly, waiting for someone with bad intentions to find it. And backups. Backups are the unglamorous hero of cybersecurity. They don't make headlines, but they stop disasters. Yet I've seen companies with backup systems that hadn't been tested in years. They assumed they were fine until the day they needed them. And on that day, they discovered that the backups were corrupt or incomplete or stored somewhere nobody could access. I've seen companies pay ransoms not because they didn't have backups, but because they didn't have working backups. These are the pillars that hold everything else up. They're not exciting, but they're essential. And yet many organisations skip ahead to the shiny stuff because it feels more modern. It's like installing a state-of-the-art alarm system on a house where the doors don't close properly. I remember a leadership team who were convinced they were doing brilliantly. They had invested heavily in a new SIEM, they had a shiny SOC dashboard, and they had a lot of confidence in their ability to detect threats. But when we benchmarked them, their detection capability was actually one of their weakest areas, not because the tools were bad, but because nobody was tuning them. Nobody was reviewing the alerts or correlating events. The tools were there, but the processes weren't. And once they saw that, they realized they needed to shift their focus. They didn't need more tools. They needed to make better use of the ones they already had. Another challenge is the gap between technical teams and leadership. Security professionals see risk in terms of vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and threat actors. Leadership sees risk in terms of operational disruption, financial impact, and reputation. Both perspectives are valid. But when they're not aligned, organizations end up investing in controls that don't support the business's real priorities. I once worked with a company where the board was absolutely convinced that their biggest risk was phishing. They'd had a couple of incidents, so it stuck in their minds. Meanwhile, the technical team was losing sleep over a critical database that only one person understood. If that person left or got hit by a bus, the business would have been in serious trouble. But because the board didn't see that risk in their language, it never made it onto the agenda. That's the kind of misalignment that keeps organizations stuck. I've also seen the reverse. Technical teams pushing for advanced monitoring, threat hunting, and behavioral analytics, while the board is more concerned about the resilience of client-facing services. Both sides think they're doing the right thing. Both sides think they're protecting the business. But because they're not talking about risk in the same way, the organization ends up spending money without improving clarity. This is where benchmarking becomes powerful, not as a sales exercise or as a compliance tick box, but as a way of creating a shared understanding of where you stand today. A benchmarking exercise gives you a baseline that everyone can see and agree on. It shows you what's strong, what's weak, and what's quietly holding the whole organization back. It cuts through assumptions and replaces them with evidence. It gives leadership a clear picture of what they're funding and why, and it gives security teams a structured way to prioritize their work. When we run a benchmarking session, it's not about catching people out. It's about surfacing the reality of how the organization operates. You'd be amazed how often people discover things they didn't know. A system nobody realized was still in use. A supplier nobody had reviewed in years. A control everyone assumes someone else was managing. It's not about blame, it's about clarity. I remember one organization that was convinced their biggest weakness was endpoint security. They'd spent months researching new tools, comparing features, looking at vendors. But when we benchmarked them, the real issue wasn't endpoints at all. It was change management. They had no consistent process for deploying updates, no tracking of configuration changes, and no way of knowing whether a system had drifted out of compliance. The endpoints weren't the problem. The process was. And once they fixed the process, the endpoint issues practically solved themselves. Another organization used benchmarking because they were about to invest in a major cloud migration. They assumed their biggest gaps would be around cloud security controls. But the assessment showed that their real weakness was supplier management. They had dozens of third parties with access to sensitive data, and nobody had reviewed those relationships in years. The cloud migration wasn't the risk, the supply chain was. And once they saw that in black and white, they changed their priorities completely. Organizations are often convinced they need to invest in a new identity management system, and then they discover that their real issue was that nobody was offboarding users properly. They didn't need a new tool, they needed a process. I've seen organizations who thought they needed advanced threat detection discover that their firewall rules hadn't been reviewed in years. Others who thought they needed to invest in zero trust discovered that they didn't even have an accurate network diagram. These aren't glamorous problems, they're not the kind of things that get you applause at conferences. But they're the things that make the biggest difference. And this is where a service like Scorecard comes in. Scorecard is deliberately simple, inexpensive, and accessible. It's based on the Cyber Assessment Framework, which is one of the most practical, grounded frameworks out there. The CAF isn't about ticking boxes. It's about understanding whether you can defend yourself, whether you can detect issues, whether you can respond, and whether you can recover. The CAF works because it forces you to look at the fundamentals. It doesn't let you hide behind shiny tools. It doesn't let you pretend that a new dashboard equals maturity. It asks questions that expose the truth. Do you know what you've got? Do you know who has access? Do you know what's normal in your environment? Do you have a plan for when things go wrong? Do you test that plan? Do you learn from incidents? Do you manage your suppliers? Do you understand your dependencies? These are the questions that matter. It also forces you to think about governance. A lot of organizations focus heavily on technical controls but neglect governance. They don't have clear roles and responsibilities. They don't have clear decision-making processes, escalation paths, or oversights. And without governance, even the best technical controls can fail. The CAF shines a light on that. Scorecard takes this structure and makes it usable. Organizations answer a set of questions. Secarma's consultants review those answers, score each area, and design a series of recommendations that reflect the organization's real-world priorities. It's not a generic report. It's not a tick box exercise. It's a way of showing you where your efforts will have the biggest impact. And because the recommendations are grouped and prioritized, organizations can choose the actions that matter most to them, whether that's resilience, regulatory alignment, operational continuity, or simply reducing the likelihood of a major incident. And the thing people often tell me afterwards is that they finally feel like they have a plan that makes sense, not a plan that tries to do everything. Not a plan that's built around whatever tool a vendor is pushing this month. A plan that reflects their business, their risks, their capabilities, and their reality. The CAF is structured around 4 key functions: managing security risk, protecting against attacks, detecting security events, and minimizing the impact of incidents. Those functions cover everything from governance to technical controls to resilience. They force you to look at your organization holistically. They force you to think about how everything fits together. They force you to think about the entire life cycle of an incident, not just prevention. Our cybersecurity scorecard has been used in some really creative ways. One organization used it as part of their onboarding for new IT staff. They wanted new team members to understand the organization's strengths and weaknesses from day one. Another used it as part of their supplier review process. They asked key suppliers to complete a scorecard assessment so they could compare their maturity levels. Some even use it to support their insurance renewal. They show their insurer that they have a structured approach to risk management, which helps them negotiate better terms. And then there are the organizations who use Scorecard as a way to build a culture of continuous improvement. They run it every 6 months, tracking their progress. They celebrate their wins and use it to guide their training. They use it to guide their investment and to guide their conversations with leadership. It becomes part of how they operate. I've seen Scorecard used to support budget requests in some really effective ways. One organization used their Scorecard results to show the board that their detection capability was weak. They didn't ask for a specific tool. They didn't ask for a specific solution. They asked for investment in improving their detection capability. And because they had evidence, because they had a structured assessment, because they had a clear explanation of why it mattered, the board approved the investment. Not because they were scared, but because they understood the risk. I've also seen Scorecard used to support decisions about what not to do. One organization was considering investing in a new identity management system, but their Scorecard results showed that their biggest gaps were in governance and supplier management. They realized that investing in identity management wouldn't address their most critical risks, so they postponed the identity project and focused on governance and supplier management instead. That decision saved them a lot of money and a lot of time. One of the things that often comes up in scorecard discussions is the idea of technical debt. A lot of organizations have technical debt. Legacy systems, outdated processes, old configurations, incomplete documentation, and that debt creates risk, complexity, and fragility. Scorecard helps you identify that debt and understand where it is. It helps you understand how much risk it creates and decide what to do about it. Quite often, the process empowers you to realize that it isn't an insurmountable problem, and this realization can change everything. One of the things I've noticed is that organizations often have a higher tolerance for risk in areas they understand and a lower tolerance for risk in areas they don't. For example, they might be comfortable with some level of risk in patching because they understand patching, but they might be uncomfortable with any level of risk in supplier management because they don't understand it. Scorecard helps balance that. It helps organizations understand all areas of risk, not just the ones they're familiar with. Organizations often underestimate how powerful it is just to have a shared understanding of where they stand. I've seen teams who've been arguing for months suddenly align within half an hour of seeing the same scorecard results. Not because the results were shocking, but because they were objective. They weren't based on who shouted loudest or who had the most influence. They were based on evidence, and evidence has a way of cutting through the noise. One of the most interesting things about Scorecard is how it changes the conversation around risk. Instead of talking about threats in abstract terms, organizations start talking about capability. Instead of saying, "We're worried about ransomware," they start saying, "Our backup testing is weak," or "Our access control is inconsistent," or "Our detection capability needs work." These are things you can fix, measure, and improve. And once you start talking about capability, everything becomes more manageable. A lot of organizations don't realize how interconnected their systems are until something goes wrong. Dependencies are highlighted really well by Scorecard. Companies don't realize that a single supplier can hold the keys to half their operations. They don't recognize that a single legacy system underpins multiple business processes. They don't identify that a single person holds critical knowledge that nobody else has. Scorecard forces you to look at those dependencies. It forces you to think about what would happen if something failed and to think about resilience in a practical way. I once worked with an organization that had a supplier providing a small but critical service. Nobody thought much about it because it wasn't expensive and it wasn't high profile. But when we looked at their dependencies, we realized that if that supplier went down, the organization wouldn't be able to operate. Not even for a day. They had no alternative, no backup, no contingency. And the supplier had no security controls to speak of. They didn't even have MFA. That's the kind of thing that only comes to light when you take a structured look at your environment. There's also the conflict between technical capability and culture to consider. I've seen organizations with brilliant technical controls fail because their culture was weak. People didn't report issues or follow processes. They didn't understand why controls existed and didn't feel supported. Flipping that coin, I've seen organizations with limited technical capabilities succeed because their culture was strong. People communicated, collaborated, and took responsibility. Culture makes a huge difference, and Scorecard helps you identify these challenges or strengths. And the thing is, it doesn't matter what size your organization is or what sector you're in. It doesn't matter what tools you use or how big your budget is. There's not a single organization that would not benefit from benchmarking. Every organization can gain more clarity around their cyber risks and do more to focus their effort. I've seen tiny organizations with 5 employees use benchmarking to transform their security posture, and I've seen massive organizations with thousands of employees use scorecard-style processes to align their teams. Organizations in all sectors, from finance to healthcare, manufacturing to retail, and education to government, can improve their capability because Scorecard is based on principles that apply everywhere. One of the things I always emphasize is that cybersecurity is a team sport. It's not just the security team, it's not just IT, it's not just leadership, it's everyone. Everyone has a role and a responsibility, everyone contributes, and benchmarking helps reinforce this. It shows people how their work fits into the bigger picture. It shows people why their role matters and how they contribute to the organization's security, and this builds engagement. People's care for what they do really increases, and this makes a huge difference. Another thing Scorecard helps with is communication. Cybersecurity can be difficult to communicate. It can be technical, it can be abstract, it can be overwhelming. Scorecard simplifies it. It gives you a way to communicate clearly. It gives you a way to communicate consistently and effectively. It gives you a way to communicate with leadership, with teams, with suppliers, with regulators, with auditors. It gives you a common language. Different organizations use benchmarking processes in different ways. Some use it to build a tailored roadmap, one that reflects their actual risks rather than a generic best practice list. Others use it to demonstrate improvement over time, especially after investing in new tools or processes. It's one thing to say you've improved your cybersecurity posture. It's far more powerful to show it with measurable evidence. Some organizations use benchmarking when a new chief information security officer joins the business. It gives them a clear, objective view of the current state of play without relying on inherited assumptions or internal politics. Others use it to support budget conversations, when you can show where the gaps are, why they matter, and how you compare to similar organizations. And some organizations use benchmarking during mergers and acquisitions. When you're acquiring a company, you need to know what you're inheriting. A structured assessment gives you clarity about the risks, the technical debt, and the work required to bring everything up to standard. One of the most powerful things about benchmarking is that it gives you a way to measure improvement over time. Cybersecurity can feel like a treadmill. You're always working, always patching, always updating, always responding, but it's hard to see progress. Scorecard gives you a way to show that progress. You can look back a year later and say, we were weak here and now we're adequate. We were adequate here and now we're strong. We didn't have a process for this and now we do. We didn't test our backups and now we test them quarterly. This kind of visibility is incredibly motivating for teams. It shows them that their work matters. It shows them that they're making a difference. One of the things I love about Scorecard is that it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what to do or which tools to buy or projects to prioritize. It gives you information. It gives you insight. It's up to you to decide what to do with that. You decide what matters and what to prioritize. You decide how to move forward. It's your roadmap. It's your journey. Scorecard just helps you see the path. And this kind of focus shifts the conversation towards productivity. Instead of arguing about tools or reacting to incidents, teams start talking about priorities, dependencies, and outcomes. Leadership is no longer asking whether the organization is secure, they're asking whether the organization is improving. Security teams start to feel focused rather than overwhelmed, and instead of cybersecurity being seen as a cost center, it becomes a strategic enabler. There's a story I often tell about a firm that believed they were behind the curve. They felt underfunded, understaffed, and under pressure. But when we benchmarked them, we found they were actually ahead of many of their peers in the areas that mattered most for their business. They weren't perfect, but they were stronger than they realized. That insight changed everything. It gave them confidence, it helped them defend their decisions, it helped them explain to the board why certain investments mattered and why others could wait. Benchmarking doesn't magically fix your security posture. It doesn't eliminate risk, but it does give you clarity. And clarity is the thing most organizations are missing. When you know where you stand, you can decide where to go. When you know what matters, you can stop wasting energy on what doesn't. When you know which controls are foundational, you can build a program that actually works. And when you can show your progress over time, you build trust with leadership, regulators, clients, and your own teams. Cybersecurity will always be a moving target. Threats evolve, technology changes, businesses grow in ways that create new risks. But the organizations that thrive aren't the ones that try to do everything. They're the ones that understand themselves. They're the ones that focus their efforts where it counts. They're the ones that use benchmarking not as a vanity metric, but as a compass. I've got a couple of minutes left, so that's just enough time to show those who are interested a quick walkthrough of the Scorecard experience in my Secarma. This is our structured approach to assessing your organization's cybersecurity across the key security domains. From the Scorecards page, you can view both your current assessment and any previous assessments completed by your organization. At a glance, you'll see the status of each assessment, when it was started, and access to historic results, allowing you to track progress over time. When you open an assessment, you're taken to the overview screen. Here, you can quickly understand where you are in the process with a clear indication of your progress, the estimated time required to complete the assessment, and the number of security domains included. Each security domain shows how many questions it contains, helping you plan your approach. When you're ready, simply continue the assessment or jump directly into a specific domain. The assessment journey has been designed to make completion as straightforward as possible. Questions are presented one at a time, allowing you to focus on the information being requested without feeling overwhelmed. Where additional context is helpful, you'll find guidance explaining why we're asking certain questions and how your responses contribute to the overall assessment. You can answer each question at your own pace, add notes to provide extra detail for your assessor, and save your progress at any time before returning later. Once you've completed all of the questions, select Review Assessment to carry out a final review of your responses. If you're happy that everything is accurate and complete, simply choose Submit Assessment to send it to our consultants for review and scoring. Following consultant review, completed assessments become available through the scorecard dashboard, giving you access to your results and insights whenever you need them. The dashboard has been designed to provide meaningful insights for different audiences across your organisation. You'll see your overall score and how it compares with previous assessments, helping you understand quarter-on-quarter progress. The maturity rating provides an indication of where your organisation currently sits within the cyber assessment framework, while recommendations for future assessments help guide your next steps. You can also explore how you performed across each security domain, review the areas where you scored strongly, and identify opportunities for improvement. Priority actions highlight the recommendations our consultants believe will have the greatest impact on improving your cybersecurity posture, while the executive summary presents key findings in a format suitable for senior leaders and decision makers. Selecting an individual security domain allows you to drill down into the detail behind your results. Here you'll see scores for each control area within that domain, together with the findings identified during the review process and the tailored recommendations provided by our consultants. This helps you understand not only what improvements could be made, but where to focus your efforts first. You can also revisit the answers submitted as part of the assessment. Having access to your original responses allows you and your colleagues to understand how findings and recommendations relate back to the information that was provided at the time. This historic view supports ongoing improvement by making it easier to compare assessments, monitor progress, and demonstrate how your organization's cybersecurity maturity has evolved. The scorecard's experience provides a clear, collaborative view of your organization's cybersecurity maturity, helping you understand where you are today and where to focus next. If you take one thing away from my talk today, let it be this. You don't need to chase every trend or buy every tool. You need to understand your business, understand your risks, and build your security program around the things that genuinely matter. A structured benchmarking exercise is one of the most effective ways to do that. Whether you use something like Scorecard or another method entirely, the goal is the same. Clarity, focus, direction. And if you want to explore what that could look like for your organisation, there are ways to do it that are collaborative, objective, and grounded in real-world experience. But even if you never use a formal tool, the principle remains. Start with understanding, build on evidence, prioritise what matters, and let everything else fall into place behind it. That's how you build a security posture that actually protects your business. It's how you build resilience, confidence, and clarity, and a program that really works.